forms and means of struggle of the masses. The popular character of the revolution of 1905-1907 clearly manifested itself not only in the broad participation of workers and peasants in it, but also in the sharp predominance of such specifically national forms of struggle, like a strike, a demonstration, an uprising. Particularly of great importance in the revolution of 1905-07 was the strike. It was the main form of the struggle of the working class during the entire period of the First Russian Revolution. The strike movement in 1905-1907 reached an unprecedented scale, leaving behind the highest strikes that had ever occurred in countries such as England, the USA and Germany. Only in January-March 1905 more than 810,000 workers took part in the strikes. During the whole of 1905, about 3 million strikers took part in the strikes. In order to understand the significance of these figures, it must be remembered that in the whole decade preceding the beginning of the revolution, the number of strikers in Russia amounted to no more than 430,000. Beginning in January 1905, strikes in Russia proceeded continuously, acquiring an increasingly offensive character every month. Following the May Day strikes that swept over 200,000 workers, a period of summer strikes began, among which the strike of the Ivanovo-Voznesensk weavers was particularly prominent. It began on May 12 and was held under the leadership of the Northern Committee of the RSDLP and its Ivanovo-Voznesensk group, created by the Bolsheviks. The strikers demanded that the owners introduce an 8-hour working day, cancel overtime, establish constant quotations, establish a minimum wage, the same for men and women, eliminate fines, improve the hygienic conditions of production, freedom of association, strikes, from workers and administration to resolve misunderstandings that will arise between workers and entrepreneurs. The strike, started by the textile workers, quickly expanded. Soon it was joined by printers, railway workers, shoemakers and tailors. On the advice of the Bolsheviks, the workers resolutely rejected the demand of the authorities to negotiate with each entrepreneur separately. Instead, it was decided to elect representatives from each factory, which constituted a special council of workers' representatives. The strikers were instructed to represent and defend the interests of all the workers who took part in the strike. The Council of Workers' Deputies directed the entire course of the strike. He created a working militia, which supported the public order. To help the strikers, a strike fund was established. On May 19, textile workers Shuya, Orakovotsuev and other cities started a strike, presenting the same demands to the administration as the Ivanovo-Voznesensk textile workers. The authorities unsuccessfully tried to stop the strike. The police and troops dispersed the meetings of the strikers by force. In response, the workers were defeated by a number of factories and factory owners' houses. Despite all the efforts, the authorities failed to suppress the strike of the Ivanovo-Voznesensk workers. It was discontinued at the beginning of August by the workers themselves, as decided by the Council of Workers' Plenipotentiaries. The strike of Ivanovo-Voznesensk workers, in which up to 70,000 people took part, exerted a tremendous influence on the workers of the whole central and industrial region, especially textile workers, who, under its influence, actively joined the revolutionary movement. The summer strikes that covered all the most important industrial regions of the country and which were often accompanied by bloody clashes between workers and the police and troops, for example, in Lodz, Warsaw, Riga, etc., as well as the September speeches of workers in Moscow, prepared the revolutionary proletariat for a grandiose all-Russian political strike in which over 2 million people participated. Open campaign for a general strike among the workers was held back in September. The wave of strike movement began to grow particularly rapidly from the beginning of October. The strike of printers, which began on September 19 in Moscow, spread to a number of other cities. In St. Petersburg on October 3, workers of printing plants began to strike. The next day, the workers of a number of other enterprises, including the workers of the Nevsky and Semyonnikovsky plants, went on strike. On October 7 at 2 o'clock, the railway workshops of the Moscow-Kazan road stopped. By the evening of the same day, the remaining workers of this road were on strike. Within a few days, the strike swept workers of 79 enterprises in Moscow. On October 8, the movement of trains at the Ryazan-Ural, Kazan, Yaroslavl, Kursk, Nizhny Novgorod lines ceased. On October 12, 14 roads were on strike. On the railways, with a total length of almost 40,000 versts, the movement of trains stopped. About 750,000 workers and employees of the railways joined the strike. The movement, which began in Moscow and St. Petersburg, was transferred to other cities. On October 11, a general strike began in Kharkov, on the 12th in Kiev, on the 13th in Chelyabinsk and Irkutsk, etc. The strike took on an all-Russian scale. It was held under the slogans, "Down with the autocracy! Long live the Democratic Republic!" It involved not only industrial workers, but also railway workers, employees of state institutions, workers of shops, banks, etc. Thousands of industrial enterprises were stopped. The telegraph, mail, banks ceased to function. Under the mighty onslaught of the revolutionary proletariat, the Tsar was compelled to issue a manifesto on October 17, in which he hypocritically promised to give the people political freedoms and to convene instead of the Bumblebulegan Duma, swept away by the wave of revolutionary action by the working class, the Legislative Duma. The mass action of the working class in October 1905 brought the people the first serious, albeit short-term, victory. During the October political strike, freedom of the press, of speech, of trade unions and other organizations was won. Censorship was eliminated. For the first time in the history of Russia, revolutionary newspapers began to publish freely. In view of the fact that the Tsarist government forbade the existence of any kind of organization of the working class, trade unions in Russia rose later than the Party of the Working Class. The proletariat of Russia won the right to the existence of trade unions in the fire of the revolutionary struggle of 1905. By uniting the broad strata of the working class, the trade unions were an important means of organizing and uniting the proletarian masses. The Bolsheviks waged an uncompromising struggle against the Mensheviks, seeking to lead a professional movement and lead it along a revolutionary path. They untiringly exposed the opportunism of the Mensheviks, who denied any role of trade unions in the political struggle of the proletariat, restricting their activity to the sphere of economic struggle alone. Under the leadership of the Bolshevik Party, the professional movement in the autumn and winter of 1905 reached a considerable scale, becoming an important factor in the liberation struggle of the working class. The greatest significance of the October political strike consists primarily in the fact that it moved the work of the political education of the working class with great force. The great scope of the strike movement in 1905 revealed the greatest revolutionary possibilities of the proletariat, irrefutably proved that the revolutionary energy that it can develop during the revolution is immeasurably higher than its share in the population of the country. It constituted a minority of the population, the working class in 1905, with its speeches, imposed a proletarian imprint on the entire course of the revolution. In a report on the revolution of 1905, Lenin called it proletarian, not only in the sense that the proletariat was the guiding force, the vanguard of the movement, but also in the sense that the specifically proletarian means of struggle, namely the strike, represented the main means of swaying masses and the most characteristic phenomenon in the undulating growth of decisive events. 1. Lenin pointed out that the revolution of 1905-07 in world history was the first revolution in which the mass political strike played an unusually large role. At the forefront of the strike struggle at all the stages of the First Russian Revolution was the advanced attachment of the working class of Russia, the metal workers. Lenin pointed out that if every 100 factory workers gave 160 strikers in 1905, then every 100 metal workers gave 320 participants in strikes. Metal workers with their performances carried away the waverers, awakened the sleeping, encouraged the weak. A remarkable feature of the unprecedented scale of the strike struggle in 1905 is the combination of political action by the working class and economic strikes. It was the close relationship of political and economic strikes that ensured the enormous scope of the movement, which no country in the world knew equal. Thanks to the economic strike, even the most backward strata of the working class were drawn into the revolutionary struggle. The mass strike movement prepared the working class for an armed uprising against Tsarism. At all the stages of the First Russian Revolution, the heroic struggle of the working class was supported by active revolutionary actions by the peasantry. The movement of 1905, wrote Lenin, is historically characterized precisely by the fact that the vast majority of the population of Russia, namely the peasantry, put the land issue at the very first place, too. As the revolutionary events unfolded, the peasant movement continually increased. So, if in the spring of 1905 the peasant movement covered the seventh part of the districts, then in the autumn of the same year it covered up to one-third, and in 1906 the flame of peasant unrest raged in half the districts of Russia. During 1905, over 3,500 peasant speeches were recorded. In the autumn of 1905, real peasant uprisings took place in such areas as the Central Black Earth Belt, the Volga region, Ukraine, the Transcaucasus, and the Baltic states. Armed with 1. V. Lenin. Works, Volume 23, p. 231. 2. V. Lenin. CIT, Volume 20, p. 349. Staves, forks, cudgels, sometimes with firearms. Peasants attacked the landed estates, smashed the estates, seized and shared the property that was there. V. Lenin noted that peasants in 1905-1907 burned more than 2,000 landed estates. Extremely great importance in the development of the peasant movement was played by the agrarian program developed by V. Lenin, which provided for the transfer to the peasants of landlord, ecclesiastical, monastic and other lands. By the beginning of the revolution of 1905-1907, the peasantry, as a result of the development of capitalism in agriculture, no longer represented an economically homogeneous mass. Inside it a relatively small, about 18.5% group of well-to-do peasants, who held in their hands not only the lion's share of the deed and the rented land, but also a much larger proportion of allotment land compared to its share. By its position, this group of peasants differed sharply from the bulk of the rural population. It was the rural bourgeoisie, the kulaks who, like the landowners, oppressed and exploited the rural poor, who constituted not less than 60% of the peasant population. Despite the fact that the kulaks, as well as the entire peasantry, sought to seize the landed estates, they usually stood aloof from peasant demonstrations, and sometimes helped the authorities to suppress the unrest in the village. The main and most active part of the participants in the peasant movement was the rural poor. It was peasants, the poor and middle peasants who thundered the landed estates, set fire to the estates, took landlords' bread from the fields, and seized the landed estates. In 1905-1906, along with peasant unrest against the landowners, peasants against kulaks took part in a number of gubernias, for example, in Ryazan, Kharkov, Poltava, Chernigov, Yekaterinoslav, and others. In a number of regions of the country, the strike campaign of agricultural workers reached a significant scale, especially in the fall of 1905. The Bolsheviks attached great importance to strengthening their ties with village laborers, using these ties to unite the poor peasantry and the middle peasant masses and to involve them in active participation in the revolutionary struggle. True, the peasant speeches and in 1905 were in general the same spontaneous, unorganized, fragmented nature, as in previous years. However, now the aspirations of the peasants to seize the landed estates were much more vivid, and attempts to resolve the agrarian question by themselves were more resolute. This is due not only to the increased acuteness of the agrarian question in Russia, but also to the fact that now the peasant masses in their struggle could rely on the working class, which has become more stoic and organized. The proletariat resolutely supported all the revolutionary actions and demands of the peasantry. In 1905–1906 in a number of provinces there were many joint actions by workers and peasants. The working class party sent tens and hundreds of its workers to the countryside, explaining to the peasants the essence of the revolutionary events that took place in the country, calling and raising them to fight, sending thousands of copies of social democratic leaflets, newspapers and pamphlets. All this had a great influence on the peasant masses, contributing to the intensification of their revolutionary struggle. The increased level of political consciousness of the peasant masses in the course of the revolution of 1905–1907 is evidenced by rather numerous facts. Peasant speeches with such general political demands as the convocation of people's representatives on the basis of universal equal and secret elections, the replacement of state taxes and duties with progressive income tax, political prisoners, and so on. And so on. And all this suggests that the poor and middle peasant masses of the peasantry with credibility in the eyes of the working class, and in fact is Viva recording his fighting ally. The union of the forces of the proletariat and the peasantry, wrote Lenin, was not in the idea of existing, and hardly began to incarnate in life, but characterized the entire first period of the Russian Revolution. All the major events of 1905–1907, the October strike and the December uprising, on the one hand, peasant uprisings on the ground and the uprising of soldiers and sailors were precisely the alliance of forces, of the proletariat and the peasantry. This union was elemental, unformed, often unconscious. These forces were unorganized enough, they were fragmented, they were deprived of really leading central leadership, etc., but the fact of a union of forces, between the proletariat and the peasantry, as the main forces that broke the gap in the old autocracy, is indisputable. Not understanding this fact, one cannot understand anything in the results of the Russian Revolution. 1. The mass actions of the proletariat in the city, the growth of the peasant movement in the countryside, all this shaken the most lasting and last support of Tsarism the army. This is evidenced by a number of uprisings that took place in the army and navy in 1905–1906. The most significant of them was the uprising on the battleship Potemkin. It broke out in the conditions of a steady rise in the wave of strikes and strikes throughout Russia in the summer of 1905. This uprising was due to the deep discontent that reigned on all ships and in all parts of the Russian army and which reflected in its own way. 1. V. Lenin. Works, Volume 15, p. 305. Sharpness of class contradictions in the country. However, the insurgent sailors were still not sufficiently mature in the revolutionary attitude of the masses. Deprived of firm revolutionary leadership, the sailors of Potemkin made a number of serious mistakes. They did not unite with the Odessa workers, did not support their strikes, did not give them weapons. Left alone, the sailors of the Potemkin, despite all their heroism, eventually had to go to Constanta and surrender there to the Romanian authorities. The rebellion on the battleship Potemkin was of great importance. Lenin regarded it as the first serious attempt to create the nucleus of a revolutionary army, without which the victory of the revolution is impossible. The revolt of the sailors of the battleship Potemkin was not a single performance. Under the mighty impact of the October general political strike in the autumn of 1905, there were military uprisings in Kharkov, Kiev, Minsk, Voronezh, Tashkent and other cities. Revolutions broke out in the Baltic and Black Sea fleets. The most significant of these uprisings was the uprising in Sevastopol, which began on November 12. In addition to the sailors, workers and soldiers of the Sevastopol garrison took part in it. During this uprising, an attempt was made to create a council of workers, sailors and soldiers' deputies. The most active role in military uprisings was played by those elements of the army and navy who were recruited mainly from the industrial proletariat, which once again testifies to the leading role of the working class in the Russian Revolution. With its revolutionary example, the Russian proletariat inspired the working masses of all nationalities of Russia to fight Tsarism. At all the stages of the Russian Revolution, the workers and peasants of Ukraine, Belorussia, Poland, the Baltic, the Transcaucasia, Central Asia and other suburbs of Russia stood shoulder to shoulder with the Russian proletariat and the peasantry against the Tsar and the landlords. The Russian proletariat fervently supported the national liberation struggle of the non-Russian peoples of Russia, acting as a consistent fighter for giving all nations of the empire the right to self-determination. Consequently, the Russian proletariat was the spokesman of the fundamental interests not only of Russian, but of all other peoples of our country. Thus, in the year of 1905, the broad masses of the people, the oppressed classes of all the nations of the Russian Empire, were raised to fight the bold actions of the working class by defending Tsarism. This fact clearly reflected the popular character of the First Russian Revolution.